Lovely to see so many of you joining us here today. So before we get started with today's Voices for Action webinar, just a bit of housekeeping. So Leif, if I could get the agenda slide up, please. Just a note that part of the session will be recorded for future sharing, and we invite you to use the chat to introduce yourself, let us know where you're joining from, and the city and organization where you work. The presentation is in English and closed captioning is available. All participants will be muted and your video will be turned off. If you have any questions for our speakers today, please feel free to submit them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and time permitting, we'll try and answer these questions at the very end of the webinar. We're going to be covering a lot in just 60 minutes today, but additional resources, reports, and websites that are mentioned by our speakers will be shared in the chat and also in a follow-up email that will be sent to you after the webinar. After leaving the webinar, you'll have the option to complete a short survey, and we appreciate in advance your thoughtful feedback as it really helps us to inform future sessions. So I'd like to start us off today in a good way with an acknowledgement of the land that I'm on. I'm located here in Toronto, a word derived from Mohawk that means where the trees are standing in the water. And today, Toronto is covered under Treaty 13 and the Williams Treaties. It's the traditional territories of many First Peoples, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, a treaty where nations entered into an agreement to protect the land and responsibly care for its resources in harmony together. As settlers, newcomers, refugees, and Indigenous people, we've all been invited into this treaty and others in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. I'm mindful personally of the broken treaties that persist across Turtle Island today and recognize our responsibilities as treaty people to engage in a meaningful and continuous process of truth and reconciliation with all of our relations. GCC is committed to advancing decolonization and anti-racism while centering the voices, leadership, and joy of Black, Indigenous, racialized, trans, and non-binary communities. While this work is underway, it's certainly never over. It's informed by our approach to internal processes, programming, philanthropic strategy, and the future we envision together. Today's session reflects our commitment to an equitable and just climate transition. Next slide, there we go. So we know that sustainable and climate-ready communities are needed, and we know that this need is urgent. For 30 years, Green Communities Canada has connected and supported community organizations across the country to accelerate climate action. We're deeply focused not just on the why we should take climate action, but the how. How do we make the momentous shifts that are needed in such a short period of time? How do we address the very real barriers that communities, and particularly marginalized communities, face to taking action? How do we ensure that our work is intersectional and inclusive? And how do we make these shifts last? Our programs are diverse and always transforming, but our goal remains the same: invest in building the local capacity that's needed to accelerate ambitious climate solutions. Next slide. Today, we support more than 100 organizations, and together we drive equitable and transformative change from coast to coast to coast. We do this by providing a network for organizations to share resources and knowledge, offering programming and services that organizations can roll out on the ground, and importantly, funding these organizations to lead this vital work. Next slide. Our work at GCC focuses on 3 areas of climate impact: sustainable mobility, residential energy efficiency, and green infrastructure. GCC has been leading sustainable mobility programming for several decades. These programs support schools, families, and especially children to reduce fossil fuel emissions, improve air quality and traffic safety, and increase physical and mental health. With our partners, GCC leads research, advocacy, and training programs, sharing a wealth of resources to advance our collective goals. GCC was a founding member of Canada Walks, Active School Travel Canada, and the Canadian Active Transportation Alliance. These coalitions worked closely with the Government of Canada to support the creation of Canada's first ever National Active Transportation Strategy and Fund. We also lead the Canadian Electric School Bus Alliance, which is advocating to electrify school buses across the country by 2040. In the 1990s and 2000s, GCC developed comprehensive school travel planning programs and toolkits that were delivered in 4 provinces. In 2017, we developed the Ontario Active School Travel Program that saw over $2 million invested in local active school travel initiatives in 62 communities. Despite dramatic cuts to provincial funding, we continue to expand this program and currently deliver school travel planning in more than 100 schools across the Greater Toronto Area. GCC is also leading the nationwide Active School Streets initiative, which will support 40 plus communities to create car-free zones in front of schools. These playful spaces improve safety and health outcomes for our children and give new life to city streets. Before I pass it to Jared and to our wonderful panelists, I want to recognize some of the generous supporters of our sustainable mobility programs, including the Public Health Agency of Canada, Trottier Family Foundation, BC Ministry of Transportation, the Province of Ontario, the City of Toronto, the Toronto District School Board and Toronto Catholic District School Board, the Small Change Fund, and Bunt and Associates Engineering. And of course, we cannot forget the amazing champions and volunteers leading safe and active transportation projects in communities across the country. Many of you are probably attending today. Thank you. And now I'm pleased to hand it off to our host for today, Jared, GCC's Managing Director, to introduce our amazing panelists.
Thanks so much, Brianna. As you registered for this for the panel discussion today, the provocation that we really jumped in on here was that in recent decades, communities across Canada have seen alarming trends. Physical activity rates for children and youth have declined. Unsafe road conditions have increased around schools. These trends are health and public safety issues. Researchers and practitioners across Canada are trying to address these issues, but they continue to face barriers. In particular, it is challenging to get reliable, consistent data on how families choose to travel to school. We measure what matters. It seems obvious that protecting children and youth matters. So why is it such a challenge to advance research and inform policy changes that benefit the demographics at highest risk? To help us answer that and several other questions today, really pleased to introduce our panelists. First off, please introduce Huwaida Hassan. She's the Director of Urban Growth and Open Space with the City of Edmonton and with Mobilizing Justice. She's over 2 decades of experience in the fields of transportation planning, urban planning, and growth management. She's currently leads a multidisciplinary team in city growth and open space planning. Marcus Duncan is Participaction's data scientist. He completed a PhD in kinesiology at UBC, focusing on physical activity measurement and mental health. He completed a postdoc fellowship at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, working in adolescent physical activity epidemiology. Meredith Soanes is she works at in the Faculty of Health Sciences at Simon Fraser University as Knowledge Mobilization Manager for a CIHR-funded team of researchers, planners, and practitioners. This team is focused on the design of healthy and equitable cities. Her research explores the impact of community design on social connectedness, health, and equity. Meredith previously worked on the Youthhood research project with the Chatter Lab at SFU, studying how youth voices can be engaged in the process of city building. Nicole Roach is the Director of Sustainable Mobility at Green Communities Canada, where she leads several large-scale sustainable mobility projects, including the Canadian Electric School Bus Alliance and the National Active School Streets Initiative. Welcome, everybody. We're pleased to have you with us. We're going to invite our panelists to offer some opening thoughts, opening comments. To kick us off, I'm going to hand it over to Huwaida.
Thanks, Jared. Good afternoon, everyone. Speaking here from City of Edmonton, which is located on Treaty 6 territory. This is the traditional territory of the Nehiyaw, Cree, Anishinaabe, Saulteaux, and the Kina'iska, and the Sitapi people. So really pleased to be speaking to you. As Jared mentioned, I'm Director of Urban Growth and Open Space at the City of Edmonton, but speaking to you today as my role serving as the co-chair of the National Survey of Transport Poverty that was undertaken by the Mobilizing Justice Partnership. So the lead academic on that was Dr. Catherine Morency, actually from Polytechnique de Montreal University. So it was a pleasure being on that project with her. So the Mobilizing Justice Partnership, for those of you who might not know, is a collaboration of academics, practitioners, nonprofit, for-profit organizations working to understand the impact of mobility equity in Canada. So the work is funded by the federal government, the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council of Canada. And the National Survey of Poverty is just one element of the research program under the Mobilizing Justice Partnership. It's the first of its kind in Canada, so it's really incredible actually to have worked on that project. It was designed specifically to understand how transport poverty is seen, experienced across the nation. The survey received responses from over 27,000 people, including 20,000 low-income households across, 41 census metropolitan areas, rural areas in every province and territory. So really an extraordinary kind of scope to the survey, which is great. It was conducted between July and November 2024, and it provides us, like I said, with this unprecedented look into everyday transportation challenges that Canadians face, especially those in equity deserving groups. So really, really interesting piece of work that's been done. What we learned broadly is that people in low-income households report that, they take fewer destinations, that fewer destinations are accessible to them by the transportation options that are available to them. And in particular, that includes accessing mental health care, community programs, volunteer activities. And so, as you can imagine, for children living in those households, we can extrapolate that they will also experience those challenges, which would affect their well-being. In the survey, there was a couple of questions that I think were particularly relevant to our conversation today. The survey looked at and asked, do the transportation options available to you, to the households that were surveyed, did they allow them to easily reach destinations for children's school or daycare? And so when you break that down by income, you find that only 20% of low-income households, so that's around earning less than $60,000 per year, agreed strongly with that statement compared to nearly 30% higher income households. So you can see that accessibility affects people differently depending on their income band. We also asked them for, transportation options that are available to them, whether they can easily get to school. And again, we saw that gap among low-income households, about 20% saying that they strongly agreed, while 25% of high income households strongly agreed. So I think like the survey data can start to point us into some interesting outcomes that can really help us to understand what are those implications of the transportation options that are available to us across the nation and how they might impact people differently in different circumstances, whether that's income or other equity deserving groups. Yeah, I'll leave it there, but I have a lot more to add a bit later. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Hoeda. We'll look forward to more comments on that. Really important work. Over to Marcus for some opening comments.
Great. Thank you for having me. For those unfamiliar with Participaction as an organization, we serve as the national voice of physical activity, driving awareness and education through various things like public education campaigns, research, and advocacy. And what I'm going to be primarily focusing on today is our work with our report card products, which is one of our flagship knowledge products and is we think the most comprehensive assessment of child and youth physical activity in Canada. And by this, while the headline is obviously physical activity levels, we also are interested in trying to examine all the factors that contribute to physical activity in all its forms. So these are things like active play and active transportation, and even the communities and spaces and places that people engage with movement. So in this regard, it synthesizes data from multiple sources to assign evidence-based grades across 14 indicators with the intention of helping policymakers, researchers, communities, and families to see how we're doing as a country, so nationally to advance movement behaviors, and where gaps tend to remain, and how we can improve our knowledge base and make changes going forward. The first report card, was released in 2005 by Active Healthy Kids Canada, but leadership has been transferred to Participaction as of 2015. And between the two organizations, we've produced 16 child and youth report cards over the past 20 years. So there's a wealth of information going back for quite some time. Now, indicators change, as the science changes, and we get better measurement tools. But it's a really powerful tool for looking at how we've done and where we're going, and to identify trends. And over the past 10 years, there have been 30 different grade changes. More than half of the report card indicators have trended positively over time, including indicators like physical education and sleep. But other indicators like overall physical activity and active transportation saw declines, and some have stagnated. And when I say grades, this is a report card, but what we do is we synthesize data from many different sources, and we have an interdisciplinary research team that identifies and assesses what are important indicators, and then assigns grades based on this best available data, research, and sort of key issues from the past. Usually it's 2 years, but since the last report card. And just as sort of a barometer check, when we give something a grade of a C, it means that about half of children and youth are succeeding. So it doesn't quite align with the report cards that you might be familiar with from your days in school, or your kids' report cards at the moment. But it is supposed to be more of a like mnemonic, quick indicator as to how we're doing, and areas for necessary improvement. So I'll leave it there, and hand the baton off.
Thanks very much, Marcus. Be great to dig in on that further. Meredith, over to you.
Thanks, Jared. It's great to be here. I'm joining today from the ancestral lands of the Tsleil-Waututh people, or North Vancouver. So when I heard the theme for today, really the first thing that came to my mind was the importance of not just sort of what we measure, but also how we measure it. So obviously, like quantitative metrics like survey measures and spatial indicators are often sort of the default in mobility research, and there's really good reasons for that. It's systematic, it's scalable, relatively simple and inexpensive to collect. So it's hugely valuable. But we also recognize while we use it all the time and are trained as quantitative researchers, that it does have limitations when it comes to children and youth mobility. So one, obviously, children are often underrepresented in things like travel surveys because adults complete them for the households. So parents may not know like all the trips their teenagers are taking, or have time to participate if they have young kids at home. And when younger age groups are surveyed, the numbers are often too small to do sort of like meaningful disaggregation. And then the second is on the environment side of things. Quantitative measures don't account for things like neighborhood perceptions around factors like quality and comfort and safety. And that really matters because we know that those perceptions often vary along demographic lines, including by age. So just like an interesting example, I work at SFU, and when I was teaching last semester, I had 100 undergrad students assess a neighborhood on campus using the popsicle test. Maybe you're familiar probably with what that is, but it's essentially a really simple test on whether an 8-year-old can safely walk to buy a popsicle and return home before it melts. And so this particular neighborhood I sent them off to is actually designed to be a complete community and has like a very high walk score. But most students, when they returned, reported that they failed the neighborhood on the popsicle test. And, the popsicles were still intact, but despite its high walk score, most students didn't see the environment as safe enough for a child to navigate independently. So, it's just my point really is that I think we need other more creative and participatory approaches to really reach children and youth and amplify their voices and lived experiences that we can sort of like augment with the quantitative methods. So how do we do that? There's a range of approaches, but one example from our lab is Youthhood, which is a community engaged research project we led in partnership with the South Vancouver Neighborhood House and others. South Van is home to mostly racialized residents who face very glaring inequities in access to active transportation infrastructure, parks, grocery stores, all sorts of amenities compared to other parts of the city. And so our aim with Youthhood, it actually wasn't specific to mobility. It was to actually understand youth's lived experiences of those inequities, in particular how their environments were helping or hindering their social connectedness. So the study used a participatory action research approach where around 40 local youth were recruited as community scientists, or some people call them co-researchers. And they used a photo voice app called the Discovery Tool to map social connectedness barriers and assets while walking around their neighborhoods, and then came together in a workshop to analyze findings and design solutions based on the themes that they prioritized. So overall, I think youth gathered over 200 geotagged assets and barriers, all with photo voice narratives, and then came together and analyzed all of that data themselves to identify themes and develop solutions. And the result was like really rich evidence, not just on sort of what features support socially connected cities for youth, but also why. And one really interesting finding was just how deeply youth connectedness was tied to car-free mobility. So, we know that a lot of youth rely on transit, walking, biking just for practical reasons because they can't drive. But they also described those modes as like social experiences in and of themselves. So it helped them interact. It gave them a feeling of sort of sense of community belonging. In lots of ways, it was like the journey mattered just as much to their connectedness as the destination. But at the same time, we found that youth experienced like a lot of barriers related to active transportation too, more so than assets, frankly, due to inadequate or poor quality infrastructure and also traffic noise. But I think what was really great about the data is that all of that place-based data they captured really highlighted issues on sort of a micro level in their neighborhood that would otherwise really only kind of slowly trickle in through complaints, really, um, to decision makers. So, very helpful in terms of informing neighborhood improvement. And in the final phase of that project, 4 youth became youth-led ambassadors, and they presented key findings from the project at various community forums, along with other residents, city staff, and a host of elected officials. And along the way, like youth were always the main messenger. So my role was more sort of as a facilitator, working behind the scenes, sort of providing the scaffolding they needed to be successful. And that community-led advocacy ultimately contributed to a Vancouver City Council motion addressing social infrastructure and equities in South Vancouver, which was unanimously passed and sort of has started a long journey of implementation, let's say, which is ongoing. Yeah, and I'll just sort of close by saying, beyond the data, there were also a lot of important lessons learned from the KT process in terms of, not just sharing data, but also sharing stories, how much the messenger matters. Sometimes it's like more powerful to have the data in the hands of the community than the hands of the researcher. And just some of the really positive things that came out of the process, irrespective of what kind of the final outcome might be. So, happy to delve into that as we keep the discussion going. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks, Meredith. Um, yeah, lots of ground to cover there. Before we do that, though, any further, over to you, Nicole, for your opening comments.
Great, thank you. I'm also joining from Edmonton, Treaty 6 territory. So Hawaii, thanks for doing the land acknowledgement for us. So at Green Communities Canada, we've been working in the active school travel space for decades, and a lot of that work on the ground has been through our school travel planning program. So with that, we connect with the school, and then we do a really detailed site audit, looking at all of the assets and travel patterns there. We also do a household or family travel survey that we distribute to parents and caregivers to learn about how their children are getting to and from school, some of the barriers and enablers to active school travel, just to understand the context better. And we also do hands-up surveys. So that's going into the classrooms and asking children to raise their hands for how they got to school that day. And we also do neighborhood walkabout and connect with other parents, caregivers, community members to really understand the context of that school. So through that process, we get some really, really rich, fantastic data about that school. And through our work, we've looked at, well, how do we compare it to other schools? Or how do we know how these school travel planning schools are doing compared to other schools in Toronto or other schools across Ontario? So our approach has been challenging to scale, but we've continued to think, how do we scale this? How do we get a baseline mode share data that we can compare to, that when we make interventions through programming or infrastructure, how are we measuring the progress and how that's changing behavior? So through that, we were able to apply to the Active Transportation Fund through the federal government, and we received funding to do pilots, called it the National School Travel Data Collection Pilot. We ran that in Ontario and British Columbia. So we did that in fall of 2023, and we've just recently released all of the results of that. So we have the results, lots of lessons learned, and some recommendations for how to do data collection at this scale. So that's what I'm here to talk about today.
Great. Thanks so much, Nicole. I'm curious about as we approach and how you approach your work, and how you interact with and use mobility data in your work. Where do you feel the data gaps most? I heard some of you comment on that kind of initially. How do these gaps have real world impact on children? Who wants to
I,
jump on that one
I
first?
can jump in and build on what Meredith was saying. So in our context, in a municipal context, we often use household travel surveys, either collected, periodically or episodically or continuously, to understand travel patterns. But we use that information to understand how people are currently using the mobility system, what for, when, that kind of thing. But this is like observed survey data. So it usually tells us about the trips that people were able to make, but not about the ones that they had to miss or were unable to complete. So it doesn't tell us about the gap. And to Meredith's point, also doesn't tell us about the perception of safety of the system, or what inclined them to use a particular mode. Was it because of a lack of safety or other reasons? So I think when we plan our mobility system based on just observed or satisfied demand, we don't get insights into what's unmet, whether that's, people have missed or suppressed certain trips, or again, that satisfaction piece. And I think I totally agree with Meredith. The surveys are of it, like even the national survey that was completed on transport poverty, you have to be 18 years old or over to complete it. So yeah, you're completing it either on behalf of yourself or on behalf of your household's experience. So again, like potentially missing, teenagers and younger children's trips and that kind of thing, and what they might be experiencing. So yeah, I think there can be certainly gaps, and I think it's just the way that at least in the municipal context, the way we plan for cities tends to be based on these repeatable, trendable kind of data that we can collect. So.
Mm-hmm.
I think national survey is a first good step, I think, to start to understand what those missed trips and perceptions and things like that can mean and look like.
Mm-hmm. That's great, Hoida.
Yeah, and I would jump in here and just echo a lot of what Meredith had pointed out. Of there's, with our work, we're not going out and doing a lot of direct data collection. It's about synthesizing big data sets that exist, and by big, I don't mean nearly as big as the tech companies would call big data. And yeah, we really do struggle with an issue of being able to disaggregate data by equity denied groups and historically marginalized peoples. In our latest report card, one of the top graphics in the full technical report shows just where there are just so many gaps and dearths of information at this national level, where ostensibly you could collect quite a number of people. There's a real lack of information for racialized people in Canada, people from low income communities. We do okay with some gender-based disaggregation, but there is a major lack of equity that we are facing as we try and make the report card and make our information more inclusive to the experiences of people across Canada, and within even within the same community who might experience it differently. So that's been a real challenge for us, and sort of a glaring gap.
Mm-hmm. Meredith or Nicole?
I can just have a quick add. As researchers, we work with data kind of on both sides of the equation. So I talked a little bit about some of the limitations around like the outcome data, but we also spent a lot of time measuring the infrastructure. And historically, finding good data on sort of what we call all ages and abilities bike infrastructure nationally was a real challenge. So something I just wanted to share with this group that a team, not me personally, but others within my lab developed is the Canbex classification system, which sort of characterizes bike infrastructure based on high, medium, and low comfort and then mapped that across Canada. And so what I think that was a major gap, and what that sort of classification system does is really improves our capacity to measure children's access to high comfort infrastructure that is suitable for all ages and abilities. And that includes surrounding schools, of course. So
Mhm. Hugely important, yeah. Nicole?
Great. Yeah, I'll add that in our work, we use this data mostly for trying to make the case for active school travel. So that could be on grant applications to decision makers or really anyone else we need to get on side. So in the context of school travel planning, it's really lovely when we can say, this is all we know about this school. This is what everything points to that they need, and then really make a strong case for programming or infrastructure changes. But on the broader scale of saying that there's a problem across Ontario, we don't know the extent of the problem. We don't have perfect numbers that say how many students are walking or biking or busing even. So as consortia or school boards that deliver busing, they have a good sense of how many students qualify for busing, but don't really have much numbers beyond that in terms of how many students are using the buses or if kids in the walk zone are walking or biking or being driven. So there's a really big gap there just in terms of transportation planning for the boards and consortia. Um, so yeah, if we don't know how kids are getting to school, then it's really hard to make the case that it needs to change. It's great if you can get someone out there to just look at a school and see the chaos in person. But when you can't do that, then you really need the numbers to back it up. So that's what we're continuing to try to get the numbers and the evidence to make that case to whoever we need to make the case to.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks, Nicole. Taking us, forward here, I'm curious about some of the research and evaluation initiatives you spoke about in your opening comments, and related to children's mobility, and those that you've been most involved with, and curious about this is the opportunity to dig in perhaps on some of those results that you really were able to elicit through those research initiatives and some of those key learnings that you discovered or, were particularly stunned by, and some of those implications. Who wants to jump on that one first?
Happy to take that on. Yep, so one of the big indicators that we're always looking at is the sort of overall physical activity levels of children and youth in Canada. Um, our previous report card rated it a D plus. That's sort of a decrease from 2022, and recent evidence from Stats Canada suggests that number is probably going to be lower the next time around on the report card. Physical activity rates, especially in youth, have greatly decreased according to the Canadian Health Measure Survey. But in terms of more of that sort of mobility component, um, active transportation is sitting sort of consistently as a C minus, and that was the same grade that we ascribed to it in previous report card. Now, mind you, that report card was from 2022 and largely focused on COVID related data. So there's obviously, a lot of things have shifted since COVID, both in terms of how we measure and what kind of active transportation we even think about, whether it's just, going to and from schools or even, those other forms of mobility, whether it's outdoor play and independent mobility in the neighborhood that give children these opportunities to explore and are really important forms of incidental physical activity that can contribute to uh, overall health. And I think, one of the sort of key findings with the active transportation grade that we were able to have actually some sort of parsed out information based on, disaggregation is that in for 50% of parents living in larger municipalities reported that their children actively commute to or from school, either, exclusively or in combination with non-active options compared to 32% of parents with children living in smaller communities. And there's always that perception of big cities being dangerous places and concern about putting letting children out to move in these places. But we see that at least for that commute to and from school, that these larger communities, probably due to infrastructure and other components, are conducive to that natural choice to use active transportation, at least in part, whether that's say using public transit as part of that active transport. So
Yeah, Marcus, like to jump in on that, I must admit I'm a little like pleasantly surprised. I know C minus is not the grade we all wanted in, grade 12 English class or whatever, but it seems higher than I was expecting overall.
yeah, I think one of the things that we really sort of struggle with some of these report cards is that some of these, what I would call like, uh, it's a bad word for it, but antecedents, these things that lift up physical activity, I think of them as we need those to be higher. We need them to be the leading indicators so that people can fill the gaps with physical activity. So ensuring that we have safe spaces, ensuring that we have good quality government investment and policies. I don't think we can expect, whether it's children or adults, to be physically active unless we have those sort of components in place. So, yeah, active transportation being, one way to get, valuable physical activity for our health. But it's one piece of the puzzle, and we need many of those pieces of the puzzle to be, creating that opportunity for people to engage in physical activity. And as we say here, that it's an opportunity to give people a chance to make room to move. And so we need to build that infrastructure and create those opportunities that allow people to choose movement as part of their everyday life.
Nicole, that seems to be something that you found to a certain degree in the National School Travel Data Collection pilot, and that that the automobile, of course, is a dominant mode of how kids are getting to school. But it sounds like that there were, of course, some other findings that were, particularly supportive of kids getting to school from pedestrian and walking and public transit and other modes. Can you say a little bit more about the initiative that you were leading there?
Sure. So the National School Travel Data Collection Pilot, we did that in Ontario and British Columbia, and we used the methods of hands-up surveys and household or family travel surveys. But I suppose the results, we had 61 schools participate in both BC and Ontario, and that was representative of about 8,500 students. So in Ontario, that was 54 schools, and in BC, only 7 schools. And then on the family travel survey side, we had 235 respondents, 74 in BC and 161 in Ontario. So we do have results, but we should also exercise caution when interpreting and applying the results and data because it's a pretty limited sample size, despite, our large ambitions of it being a national pilot and the establishing that travel mode baseline. But the results showed that the highest mode share in both provinces was traveling by car. So the average was about 50% across both provinces, about 38% in Ontario, about 62% in BC. So that's the results that we got, but there's a lot of factors that contribute. Like there were only 7 schools in BC, so where were those schools located? If they're rural, that can really skew the data. If they're urban, or different factors. And then in Ontario, we found that a lot of the schools or communities that did participate are the ones that already had existing active school travel programming or initiatives. So they were already pretty used to doing hands-up surveys. So then that could also skew the data in Ontario because it's, some of the communities that received Ontario active school travel funding, or they've been running initiatives for years. So we have numbers, but again, it's hard for that to be really representative. So we're still not at that perfect data set that we're all looking for. But it was a pilot, so there's also lots of lessons learned for how we delivered this and how to do data collection with schools at scale.
Thanks, Nicole. That's great. I mean, Hoeda and Meredith, feel free to jump in on this as well, around that research initiative related to children's mobility. That could be youthhood, that could be another as well. For you, Meredith, and Hoeda
Yeah.
for go ahead though.
Yeah, thanks. So I haven't had the chance to slice and dice the data by households with children in particular, but what I did find startling with the National Transport Poverty Survey was almost on every equity indicator, whether that's income, ethnicity, immigration status, housing tenure, that households in those brackets or in those equity groups would be lagging behind on almost every indicator when it comes to safety, travel, feeling safe when traveling by any mode, quite frankly, and having the having the need to or feeling that they must avoid some kind of travel because they don't have the options that they need available to them. So, like one startling kind of finding was low income respondents twice as likely to say that they miss commitments like work, school, or health appointments compared to high income households. So if you could just think about proportionately, households that have children in those groups and the experience that they're having being so vastly different because of the mobility options available to them. There's also, low income households, 69% own a private vehicle compared to 94% and high income households. So that disparity just, I think, becomes really pronounced when you're thinking about children, their activities, their well-being, and so on. So I'm looking forward to getting into the data a little bit more and understanding specifically households with children and the impact, but just some high level findings around some of those equity considerations.
So if I heard you correctly, they're low income respondents twice as likely to miss an appointment due to available transportation options in particular.
Yes, exactly.
That's totally startling. Meredith, over to you.
So I shared sort of already on youthhood. Another project that comes to mind from our lab, which I think is relevant for this group, is a project that looked at it was called Breaking Barriers to Cycling in Surrey, and it was a series of workshops led by Chatter in collaboration with the Surrey Local Immigration Partnership and its Surrey Youth Newcomer Council. And it looked at why e-bike share uptake is low among racialized youth, really kind of focusing on cultural perceptions and safety concerns and practical issues, like route planning. And I mentioned that just because I think it kind of just picks up on what Hawada was saying in terms of trying to get underneath to understand kind of like the underlying issues behind some of kind of what the patterns that are seen in the survey data. And so there's more information about the results from that project on our website if anyone's interested in e-bike share or is joining from Surrey.
That's great. Thanks, Meredith. Question about the challenges that you've encountered in your research. It could be privacy concerns, limited demographic data, low response rates. Were these challenges planned or surprising? And if applicable, how have you worked to overcome them? It sounds like we've heard a few so far through our discussion, but this opportunity to kind of expand on those and curious about, as I said, how you're working to address those.
I can jump on that. So one of the biggest challenges was obviously low uptake in our results. Most Some of the surprising ones to me was that our family travel survey was attacked by bots, unfortunately. So then that required so much cleaning. So that was a tricky one, unfortunate circumstances. And then also as we were doing outreach to school boards, asking them to participate in this initiative, many of them responded and said, this is cool, but can you fill in our very specific research ethics application? Said, we're trying to do this across the whole province. Like we can't fill them all in. So we did try to provide a letter, like reassure them that there isn't any identifiable data being collected, ensuring the safety of it. But many of them were not willing to entertain anything if it didn't go through their exact process. So it really highlights that doing this as like a third party as Green Communities Canada trying to gain access to school boards or schools at scale is incredibly challenging, as it would take years and so many resources to go and take that approach of filling in those applications for all the boards across the country. It just really isn't feasible.
I can jump in a little bit on the national survey, although Dr. Catherine Morency will have a bit more information, but we had anticipated, because we were trying to reach low-income households in particular and those kind of like groups that might be challenged to complete a survey, like we thought ahead to using incentives, for example. So I think that's why we were able to encourage and have so many low-income households be able to participate. So that's something I'm seeing more and more in surveys. Like I was responsible for the 2015 household travel survey here in Edmonton. We had some incentives, but we've certainly seen with the continuous survey that we're doing now, we've had to really increase those and increase the variability and the types of incentives, that kind of thing. So I think getting people's attention to complete these things is important, and also just making sure you have that right representation. So needing to diversify the types of incentives you use.
Yeah, just to add on that, like recruitment is always hard. So it's whether it's like neighborhood level research we do, or we also run large cohorts in different cities in Canada, and getting sort of representation is really difficult. Something that we found that worked really well on YouthID was to move towards sort of more community-driven recruitment, working with partners. And so, Nicole, I completely hear what you're saying with schools. So, we ended up doing recruitment through Vancouver schools and had to kind of go through that whole ethics process in order for that to be possible. So I can totally see how that's like way too onerous when you're trying to do it at scale. But definitely working with like community center staff, community service providers, like sort of meeting youth where they're at in terms of recruiting from existing kind of communities and programs was really, really helpful. And also just recruitment through really trusted voices in the community in terms of reaching equity deserving populations is so it's super valuable, we found.
Yeah, that's excellent, Meredith. Thanks for that. We're at the 10-minute mark. That's how much time we've got left in this discussion. And I want to jump to a question that came in from one of our registrants, which was, and this connects some of the findings that each of you have been, eliciting, and connecting it to municipal decision making, and results on the ground. And the question is, how do we provide better representation from children in our municipal decisions on street infrastructure and safety? For instance, would a formal working group in a community made up of a school and municipality staff be a way? What other options are there?
I can speak to like one interesting method that we used here in the city of Edmonton for when we were working on our big municipal development plan. This was several years ago, but we engaged like 1,600 kids across a variety of schools and had them develop a bit of a comic book. So we took their ideas, and I'll just drop the link in the chat if folks are interested. But
That's cool.
it's kind of like it was an interesting way to engage kids, like to get them to think about like what does their city look like, and get them to think about what is it about your city that you find interesting, or what would you like it to look like? Because it was more of a forward thinking kind of exercise, like a planning exercise. But what struck me is, and if anybody's like opening that up, you'll notice like the kids really they didn't talk about like walking and biking and taking transit and that kind of thing. They were like, oh, we should just have flying cars. And like to me, it was like reflective of like, do they just feel like that's the way they should get around their city because like the options are so few? Or like it got me thinking about why would they choose to just be outside of the urban realm altogether rather than, try and think about how to use what's available. And maybe it's like the adults haven't created like, I don't know, enough of those like tangible experiences for them to be like, no, I'd want to walk and bike. Like they'd rather just be out flying. Yeah, that was interesting. But yeah, we thought that was like a cool kind of way to engage kids, get them to think in terms of like a comic book and superheroes planning for the city. That kind of just
Yeah, I love that. I love that. In my experience, like we often, people treat their surroundings as a default. Like this is just how it is. And so challenging kids to imagine what it could be like, it's amazing that, of course, flying, just immediately taking off and going for it comes up. Meredith or Marcus or Nicole?
Sure, I can jump in. I did see that question come through, and I guess the first thing I thought of is the movement towards kind of including youth in citizen assemblies, or what you sometimes see called community assemblies. So that's where like municipalities essentially kind of form representative groups of residents that are selected by lottery and established to kind of create recommendations for council on a range of issues. My understanding, Kawada, I feel like you would know more about this than me, but sometimes sort of general, a variety of issues, sometimes specific to like particular plans. But I know the Center for Dialogue at SFU has been kind of very closely involved in supporting that process with municipalities in BC. And New West is one example that jumps out where they actually have no age restriction on participating. And so they have kind of youth participation. If you're under 16, you're supported with an honorarium, like they use tools to be able to recruit youth. And I think about 17% of the assembly in New West is under the age of 19, and there's participants as young as 13, I think, who are part of that.
Mm,
So that's one, I feel like kind of growing movement that comes to mind.
mm. Awesome.
Yeah, I don't have any experience with the actual implementation of that kind of consultation, but it's so great to hear that this is something that's a priority because that's a through line throughout our recommendations for report cards. And I would just add that it doesn't necessarily have to end at the municipality level. It can happen within schools to help inform, the development of physical activity curricula or how those curricula are implemented, as well as policies for or outdoor play spaces, like the environments themselves, to make sure that they're attractive to the kids who will end up using these spaces. So there's just so many opportunities to build things for your audience and not just with that sort of adult lens. So it's just great to see that that's something that's so desirable, and maybe that's something that we should include in future syntheses, is looking at how organizations have sort of taken these approaches to implement these recommendations. That's feedback that we've definitely received, is these are all good ideas, but it's the how do you do this and what are some good examples. So please fill up my inbox so that the next time around we can highlight these great options of the way people have implemented these kind of recommendations.
Nicole, any comments on that one?
Not too much to say, but lots of creative ways to engage children on specific projects. So the art-based initiatives or just different fun, getting them to, like the dotmocracy things, but also like dropping balls and different things, or creative ways to vote, or if they get to throw something, they love those kinds of things. So it's yeah, lots of opportunities on a project scale, but difficult to do that at scale.
Mhm.
I think that continues to be the challenge if it's like across a municipality or broader than that. So yeah, more techniques to pilot and refine there.
Totally. That's great. Final comments. I'd love to invite those from our panelists, and it's the opportunity to jump in with stuff that you were hoping to say and contribute, but haven't had a chance to yet. And it could be building off of some of those kind of key findings that you've had or startling results, and or kind of final last words. Who wants to kick us off?
I'd like to make a bit of a plug. So some of the stats I've been quoting today, I've been getting from a dashboard that's been created by the Mobilizing Justice team. And so that's going to actually be available, I believe, next week. So keep an eye out for the mobilizingjustice.ca webpage if you're a researcher or working for a municipality or just really interested in like what Canadians have to say about getting around. There's going to be lots of different ways to slice and dice the data. You can break it down by geography, whether it's provincial, by CMA, CSD. Yeah, so I think it's like really rich and unique kind of data set. So encourage people to keep an eye out on the webpage for that. Oh, and Dr. Catherine Morency also did a presentation on the survey, and so that's also available as a YouTube video on the webpage as well. So yeah, thanks.
Excellent. Thanks, Oeda.
I just want to say, yeah, thank you for this opportunity to connect with everybody, and to some of the questions before. The report card doesn't exist without the collaboration. We're so lucky to have, great collaborators at Statistics Canada, and the Canadian the Center for Fitness and Lifestyle Research Institute, CFLRI, and I really think that these opportunities to share and exchange ideas are such a great way to keep building collaboration, so that as we're all being asked to do less or do more with less, we can help lift each other up. So thank you for that, and to just keep an eye out. We've got a spotlight on youth and childhood physical activity coming out in June. Just to, in response to some of that new data that came out while we're between report card cycles. And then this fall, we'll be releasing the first ever report card focusing on the early years. So not those sort of school-age children, but in that preschool era and even before, and looking at the physical activity behaviors. So that'll be a very sort of interesting new addition to the surveillance network that is the report card.
Amazing. Thanks, Marcus. Well,
I just also want to say thanks. And yeah, just kind of one quick closing thought is just really kind of we're often challenging ourselves to think about how we can remove barriers for youth to participate in research. And that's a question that we threw out to people in youthhood. And there's a blog up ideas on what we can do kind of as a research system to be able to make it easier for them to participate. And I think it's really good to kind of listen to those ideas.
excellent. Thanks, Meredith. Nicole, final word.
Great. My final thoughts are just for this data collection and evaluation and research to be much more embedded into our systems. So there are existing surveys, and it would be great if there were more questions about how children are getting to and from school in those surveys that already exist, and for that to be integrated into strategies and targets, and that there's a lot more government leadership on this front, because it is really challenging for nonprofits or researchers to be stepping in to fill those gaps because there are just more barriers. And yeah, great to connect with everyone and learn about the amazing research work that's underway, and lots of future. Yeah, hopefully when we come back in a few years and we'll say, oh, we have this great new data set, or we tried this new method that worked really well. But I think until then, we'll just keep doing our best and trying out new methods to get as much information as we can.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so much, Nicole, Meredith, Marcus, Aweda. This has been a great conversation. I've really I've learned a lot from all of you. And we've got, and thanks for everyone who joined us today. We've got a couple pieces there on the screen for you, but we're over time by a minute. Thanks so much for being here. And stay tuned for our next Voices for Action webinar. Wishing you all the best.
Thanks, everyone.